There are many reasons why I think raised bed gardening can be a better way to garden, and I've covered a lot of those reasons in other videos. And those videos have generated a huge number of comments from gardeners who also like raised bed gardening. That's what this video today is about. 10 reasons why raised beds are better, with ideas from viewers and gardeners like you. Hi, I'm Gardener Scott, and I love that so many other gardeners are enthusiastic about raised beds too. This first reason comes from John Ryan, and he suggests that raised beds actually have fewer slug problems than in-ground beds, and this is definitely my experience as well. Now, there is a caveat to this. It does depend on how much rain you get, because if you're in a very wet region, you're probably going to have slugs in your containers, in your raised beds, and in ground as well. But for most of us that don't have a prolonged rainy period, the raised beds can cut down on those slug problems, because while the inside of a bed like these strawberries is nice and moist and the soil is great, the outside of the bed stays dry, and the slugs are less likely to crawl up a dry surface to get to plants when they can get the plants that are already on the ground. That's the path of least resistance, so they're more likely to eat the plants on the ground. One reason why I grow strawberries in raised beds is because I do have a minimal slug problem. And I don't have slugs in my raised beds, but I do have slugs eating the strawberries on the beds that I have in the ground. Another reason that raised beds are better is because they're portable. This comes from Victoria Jankowski, who rents and wouldn't be able to tear up the yard and create a garden space. But she can garden in something like these livestock tanks and have raised beds to grow a small garden, or even create a wooden box on a concrete patio and garden there. And then when she moves, it's a simple matter of just picking up the bed or disassembling it and moving it and starting all over again at the next location. You may think of raised beds as a permanent part of your landscape, but with planning and using the right materials, you can definitely move them with you when you go to another house. Sybil Cushman likes the idea that raised beds can become architectural features within the garden. And I completely agree with this, because these two raised beds I built specifically because they would look good as a central part of my garden, and they are an architectural component. I have this archway over them, and as the plants grow, it'll fill this space, and they're anchored by these beautiful wooden raised beds. I could still have the arch, I could still have the same plants, but this anchor of raised beds really adds a component, a visual component that I wouldn't be able to get otherwise. Argent Draconis suggests that the plants in raised beds will grow better because they get more light. When the sun rises in the morning, the first spot to get light is going to be the highest point in your garden. And when it sets in late afternoon, the last spot that gets light is going to be the highest spot. So it's more likely that a raised bed will get more sunlight during the course of a day. And if you've got obstacles, other beds, plants that are casting shade, well, the higher spots are less likely to be impacted by that shade. It might not be a lot. It might only be 20 or 30 minutes a day, but it could be much more depending on where the bed is located and how much shade it's avoiding. And so the plants that get that extra little bit of sunlight are going to do better than the plants that get shade earlier. In this bed I have carrots and beans and kohlrabi and okra and potatoes all growing side by side. When you use more intensive planting methods, you can grow a lot more in a raised bed and maintain it and weed it and do everything else that you need than you would in just an open space. And Jay Dixon likes this idea of raised beds providing better harvests. And that's been my experience as well. I still grow a lot in in-ground beds, but between the pathways and the bugs and the pests, I tend to get better harvests in a raised bed. If you have trees on your property, or if your neighbor has trees, the roots are going to impact your garden space. And depending on the tree, it could be worse than others. This comes from Moved North Homestead, who likes raised beds because you can grow them underneath trees or in a space that might be affected by trees, particularly black walnut trees, where the chemical juglone can kill anything that you're trying to grow in the ground. But by putting raised beds right up to a tree and filling it with a good soil, you can now grow in a space that you wouldn't be able to grow otherwise. So think about that. If you've got a space with lots of roots and you can't grow in the ground, well, grow above the ground. A better way, with raised beds. Sherry Nalder has similar concerns when trying to grow over an area that has contaminated soil. And Sherry specifically highlighted a problem she's aware of with radiation in the soil. But it holds true for chemical contamination as well. If you grow in a raised bed, like these metal troughs that have a solid bottom, then you are keeping the plants from that contaminated soil. It might take years for that soil to recover, but you could start growing right away on top of that contaminated soil by just using raised beds and getting a harvest that you wouldn't be able to get otherwise. If you use hoops over your plants for protection, everything from bird netting to hailcloth to plastic to help warm the soil and the plants, then you'll probably find that they're easier to use in a raised bed. Tom Stack thinks that this is a great reason to use raised beds, and so do I. I have my hoops in place, and when I need to cover, it's a simple matter of putting it in place, using spring clamps to hold it, and these beds are covered. I don't have to get down on my hands and knees. I don't have to worry about damaging the plants. Because of the defined space of a raised bed, I can pre-cut the material, I can have the hoops in place, and it's no extra effort at all. I don't find it as easy to do the same protection in open in-ground beds. Kathleen likes raised beds better because as a beginning gardener, she finds that they're more manageable. And I completely agree. Everything is in a clearly defined space. So as you're trying to figure out what to grow, well, you can just draw a rectangle on a sheet of paper, line out your rows, get your plan in place, come out and start putting seeds and plants in that bed. And then the management of it is extremely easy. You'll see the weeds, and without too much effort, you can just reach down and pull it out. You can see everything growing. You can see the pests almost at eye level. All of those issues that we have in our garden tend to be easier to manage in a clearly defined raised bed space. I often recommend them to new gardeners. Kathleen agrees. Mohanad Malik offers one of the simplest reasons for having a raised bed, and I'm surprised that I didn't think about this sooner and include it in one of my previous videos. A nice, sturdy raised bed doubles as a garden bench, and you've seen this in many of my earlier videos. I'm often sitting on the edge of my garden beds as I film. I also just come out in a spot like this to observe the garden, to see what's going on and just soak in the garden atmosphere. Raised beds give you that ability, and I find it much more enjoyable to sit on a bed than to sit down on the ground and try to get the same experience. So think about that as you design your beds. Design them to serve as a place to sit and enjoy your garden. If you'd like to see some of those earlier videos where I discuss some of the reasons why raised beds are better, go ahead and click on one of these links now. I'm Gardener Scott. Enjoy gardening.